Well, I'm not aiming for a no deal. I'm aiming for a deal. That's what the government's policy is for.
When you say naturally, the government, how do you mean?
Naturally, the government wants and expects us to reach an agreement with the European Union. I think that's in everybody's interests. I think economically, we don't want to see disruption to the UK's trading and economic position. I think equally we don't want to see disruption to the European economy, with Italy already in recession, with the French economy relatively flat, and the German economy undergoing problems. It's not in anyone's interests to have no deal. No deal will have disruption beyond the borders of the United Kingdom.
So not all options of Brexit are good. Some are quite bad, you think? I mean, some options of Brexit you say will damage the economy, correct?
I think no deal will undoubtedly. I think no deal will undoubtedly cause us economic disruption. I think that is unavoidable.
So one of the options of Brexit will cause economic disruption, and that you think is unavoidable?
I think no deal,
which is a Brexit option,
is a default position. It's not an option that the government would consider. The government wants to have an agreement.
But one of the results of Brexit could be no deal, yes? And the result of Brexit, therefore, you said, would be damaging to the economy. Yeah?
I've just said that, yes.
So is this how you envisage Brexit would go? That we would be looking down the avenue of something that would be damaging to the economy? I can't remember this being written on the side of a bus.
We've always wanted to have an agreement with the European Union. That's been government policy since the referendum. And we still hope that the House of Commons will vote for it.
So should those advocating a Brexit have said that Brexit will be good dependent on getting a deal with the European Union? Because not all options of Brexit are good. Clearly, you've conceded that.
Well, that's what the government's policy has always been. And if you're asking, the real question is, should we ever think of abandoning Brexit? The answer is no, because we made a political pact with the people of Britain. Parliament, all of us who are members of Parliament, said that when we voted for the referendum that we would abide by the result of the referendum. 80% of members of Parliament in this current House of Commons were elected in a manifesto, said they would honour the result of the referendum. That means we have to leave the European Union. Having accepted that that's our democratic duty, I think it's also our duty then to leave in the way that's most beneficial and least disruptive.
So if it came down to no Brexit, a revoking of Article 50, or a no-deal Brexit, which was, you said, damage the economy, you would choose the latter, to damage the economy?
My choice is to get a good deal for the UK and to persuade Parliament and those parliamentarians who have not yet been persuaded that we should vote for the government's proposals.
Interesting that you would choose a Brexit option regardless over remaining in the European Union, regardless of your own words, damage to the economy.
Chairman, I know the argument you're trying to make. I'm making a very clear point. We have a democratic duty to deliver on Brexit, and I think we have a duty to deliver it in the best way possible.
Thank you. Nigel Evans.
Secretary of State, the Prime Minister's in Northern Ireland today and was yesterday trying to sort out the backstop problem. Do you see the backstop as an issue that is soluble by the Prime Minister sufficiently that when the Prime Minister comes back to Parliament that there will be a sufficient change?
Yes, I think that it was made very clear in Parliament that the point at issue was not whether we wanted to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, but that the mechanism in the agreement would potentially keep the United Kingdom locked into an agreement that it didn't want. I think, therefore, two things are being explored. One is alternative mechanisms to provide reassurance to the people of Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic that we will not in any way accept the return to a hard border. And secondly, work being undertaken by the Attorney General on the legal text as to whether it would be legally possible to have either a unilateral mechanism for exit or to insert a time limit in that. But in either case, the government has been clear throughout that we do not wish to see a return to a hard border in Northern Ireland in any way, shape or form.
Are all the options fairly equal? Because I've read the Telegraph and the Times today and it seems...
usually a mistake, if I may say.
I could have made it worse by carrying on reading other titles, I appreciate. But the mixed messages seem to be that the Prime Minister is wedded to this backstop in one way, shape, form or another, whereas a lot of Brexiteers would just like to bin it.
Well, I think the question is whether it's the concept or the actual specific mechanism. I have not spoken to many members who say they don't want to give a guarantee of no hard border. The mechanism that has come to be known as is the backstop.
Yeah.
But it's come to mean a lot of things to a lot of people.
You don't get the impression the Prime Minister is wedded to some form of backstop, that she is looking at all the options?
Well, I think it's not to a particular mechanism, no. I think that the concept is very clear, that we must avoid that hard border for a number of reasons that have been well rehearsed.
All right. Can we
but how we actually apply that, there are a number of ways potentially to do that. That's what the government's examining at the moment. That's what the Prime Minister's been doing in her discussions, and that's what she will do when she goes to Brussels later in the week.
Okay, moving on to the trade bill. It seems to have made some progress in the House of Lords. It's at report stage, although that may be delayed. Are you quite confident that it's going to pass all its stages in time for when we leave the European Union?
I'm increasingly confident in that. And I think the fact that the committee stage in the Lords went relatively smoothly, I think gives us greater confidence in that. There is the issue outstanding of the defeat that the government suffered on the issue of scrutiny, that the government would make it clearer what the future plans were on future FTAs, not of course the content of the trade bill. Yeah. In fact, it seems that the most controversial part of the trade bill was the bit that's not in the trade bill at all. And the elements in the trade bill seem relatively uncontroversial and no one seems to have criticised them. But yes, that element of scrutiny, the government will set out exactly what is happening. We're currently in a right round process to get collective agreement on exactly how that will occur, and I will either make an oral statement to Parliament or a written ministerial statement as soon as is possible.
Right. What happens if it doesn't reach all its stages? What's Plan B?
Well, the government has set out a range of contingency plans to make sure that the three elements, the government procurement agreement, that the Trade Remedies Authority and trade agreement continuity, are able to be in place. But even if we're able to put temporary measures in place, we would still need the trade bill to be passed into law to give us long-term assurances on all of those matters.
Okay, and just to add to my...
To explain, for example, on the GPA, the statutory instrument that's been tabled gives us only an 8-month assuredness in its current form. Right. We still need to get the trade bill through, but I'm much more confident of that trade bill going through now than I have been at any point up till now.
Well, can you just clarify one thing as well? Because there again, the newspapers are full of speculation that somehow or other there'll be some form of change to the date of March the 29th, because you mentioned statutory instruments, there's a load of them that still need to be done.
And lots of days when Parliament's not sitting currently.
Yes. Well, I mean, we've got this, the recess that we're now...
Saturdays and Sundays?
We're now sitting. But, I mean, can you give a guarantee to the committee that we're leaving at 11 p.m. on March the 29th?
Prime Minister made it very clear yesterday to Cabinet that the focus is on leaving on the 29th of March, and we will do whatever is required for us to achieve that.
But the focus is there, but that leaves the door wide open for it to be either sort of a NASA-style pause or indeed 2 to 3 weeks in order to make sure that all the statutory instruments that we are dealing with during this recess week, plus, as you say, we could do the odd weekends, but do you envisage, from 100% to 0, 50-50, all that sort of stuff, go on, what do you make? What do you make, 100% certain we're leaving March the 20th? Is March the 29th the date we're leaving?
Well, March the 29th is the date in law that we're leaving.
You don't see any room for manoeuvre on that?
Well, I mean, I've been asked this question, I'm not sure it gets us very far, but that's the aim of the government, to leave on the 29th of March. Yes, there's a lot of legislation, particularly SIs, that we have to get through, but we can have more committees and we can have more days that we sit, if necessary. That's what I would prefer.
Thank you. Chris Leslie.
So, Secretary of State, just help us clear up a little bit. There's been some reporting this morning. While we're talking about the trade bill, one suggestion is that there is a plan to have a policy of unilateral tariff removal, possibly taking a power in the trade bill for the Secretary of State to be able to do that. You can rule out today for us that is not the government's plan, that's not your preference.
Well, the government hasn't taken any decision yet on what we would want to have in day one tariffs in the event of no deal.
But you can rule out unilateral tariff removal.
The government has not taken, and it's not a decision that I take. That's a collective decision across government.
So it is an option?
It is, well, there are a range of options. The first thing to say is that in the event of no deal, the tariffs that we do apply have to be applied to the EU and the rest of the world in the same way. That's very clear under our WTO.
But you understand the worry that people have about unilateral tariff reduction in terms of undercutting cheap imports, flooding in, killing our domestic markets?
I entirely understand the question, and I'm coming to that if you'll bear with me. So the first thing is that we will have to apply the same tariffs to the EU as the rest of the world. I'm not even entirely sure that's completely understood. That's the first principle. Second is that if we apply the full MFN tariffs to the European Union, that clearly would have input costs to the UK. Mm-hmm. It would have input consequences for intermediate goods coming into the UK. I remember that 23% of our exports contain imports. So that would have a financial and potentially inflationary consequence. That's at one end of the spectrum of possibilities. On the other end of the spectrum, there is full liberalisation of tariffs. That would certainly expose the UK to sudden competition in sectors to which it's not currently. It would also erode preferences for developing countries because they would lose the ability to take advantage that's conferred by lower tariffs. Going to zero would lose that preferential. There'd be preferential erosion. I've never advocated personally full liberalisation because of those very reasons. But that's a collective decision that's yet to be taken by the government.
So we've established that it is an option under consideration. It's not because I asked you whether you'd rule it out, and you wouldn't rule it out. I mean, I'm thinking about.
Well, I'm not able to rule it out because it's not my unilateral decision.
With respect, you're the Secretary of State for International Trade. It would be quite useful for us to know whether you advocate a policy.
As I've said, I made very clear that is not the position that I have advocated. But it's not a decision for me alone to take. That's a collective decision.
Okay, so if other ministers force upon you a policy of unilateral tariff reduction, which you say is still potentially under consideration, what do you say?
I didn't say it was under consideration.
Well,
I said it was a possibility.
Okay, it's a possibility. Let's stick with the phrase possibility. It's a possibility. What do you say to Laura Cohen, who's the chief executive of the British Ceramics Confederation, who talks about this being a completely foolhardy step, wrecking the home market for the ceramics sector? You understand her concern. You mentioned a while ago that would be, again, something that would be really difficult. Just to give us a sense of, the analysis that you're doing, how many people do you think are employed in the UK ceramics sector that might be affected by such a policy?
I had discussions with the sector last week. And made very clear that we would be wanting to look to see and actually ask them for specific data on which tariffs they would want to see preserved in order to guarantee the protection to the industry. We are now analysing that information that they gave us. Yeah. I made very clear, exactly as I have now, what the implications would be. Of moving to a completely unilateral. I simply set out what the technical possibilities
Should they be worried? There's 8,000 people employed in the ceramics sector in Stoke and elsewhere.
I think
this cloud is you're not able to move this cloud away from their sector today.
Well, it is not a decision that I take unilaterally, but it is very clear to us what the risks would be of unilateral tariffs in that sector, and I have set out to them exactly the considerations that we would make, and asked them for the evidence to help us to make a decision.
Just a couple.
Go on, keep going.
Because it's not just the ceramics sector. There's the farming sector, for instance.
Yeah.
You know how many people whose jobs are at stake in the farming sector?
Well, farming and food employs.
Do you know how many? Do you know how many
million.
people employed in the farming sector?
In farming and food?
Yeah. How many?
1.5 million.
know the precise figure. But
it's about
obviously
half a million
sector.
people directly in the farming sector. Obviously, more jobs associated.
It's more in
with
associated industries.
Minette Batters, who's the president of the National Farmers Union, she said that unilateral tariff reduction would absolutely savage the domestic farming sector, because you know the tariffs that are in place on dairy and meat. What are the tariff rates currently on imported goods coming into the UK for dairy, meat, roughly? Do you know
Well,
what
they're
they are?
high. I mean, they're
How high?
The EU high. I don't have the precise figures, but
Secretary
I
of
know they're
State?
often in the 40%.
What's
and so
the
forth.
import? What's the tariff on
ranges
imported?
around about 30% we estimated would be affected, and we are
About 30,
more than
39% is
more
the
than
tariff.
more than most other sectors, and representing largely agricultural seat myself.
Yeah.
I am very well aware of the impact that zero tariffs would have
Right.
on our agricultural sector.
But you can't rule it out. That possibility,
it is
that's
not-
the word, it's still a possibility.
You're asking me
Yeah.
to give an assurance that I cannot give because it's not my decision to take alone.
Okay.
Would it be a decision that I would take? That is not something that in any way, shape or form
Yeah.
that I would suggest. I think that in the
I think-
in the agricultural sector, it's very clear what the impact would be were we to move to zero tariffs.
Right. It is a high tariff currently protecting our domestic lamb, beef, sheep farmers, dairy farmers. Without that they're going to be in trouble. For
I
manufacturing,
agree.
UK manufacturing, you know what the tariff is on cars, vehicles, those sort of goods. Roughly, what is the tariff on those currently?
Well, on automotive parts, you're talking about 2.5 to 4.5%.
But vehicles...
And vehicles, you're talking on 10%.
10%, that's right, correct. So if that tariff is gone, then the domestic market there'll be far more risk to those millions of jobs in the manufacturing sector. You know how many jobs in the manufacturing sector in the UK?
For cars, automotive.
Working in UK manufacturing.
And not off the top of my head.
2.7 million people work in UK manufacturing sector, and without that level of protection, if the British market is flooded with suddenly cheap competition from China, Brazil, wherever, it puts their jobs at risk, doesn't it?
Well, we have, it's certainly true that we, in the decision that we take, will have to consider all of those elements, and they will all be considered. We also have to consider the benefits that we may have, not just for consumers, but for those elements that are part of our intermediate goods that go into our manufacturing.
But it's still a possibility.
Well, it's not unilateral liberalisation is not what I would propose, and I've not actually heard anyone else in government propose it.
But I'm just following the move to Julia Lopez. With 51 days to go to Brexit, there seems to be a philosophical rumination within the government that tariffs may or may not go. There's no hard and fast line that's giving 3.2 million people, the 2.7 million in manufacturing, the 500,000 in farming, the 8,000 in ceramics. There's nothing they can clutch to. There's no security they can hold on to. Listening to you this morning, Secretary
The
of State.
government will make a decision shortly, and we will publish those tariffs shortly.
But this is uncertainty. You've got 51 days to go, and you're leaving 3.2 million people with a question mark over their jobs because UPenn might do something to tariffs that's currently protecting their jobs.
We'll take the decision shortly, and we want to make sure we take that decision with the maximal information in front of us.
People up and down the country will hear your answer with an intake of breath. Julia Lopez.
Thank you.
They will. No, I think quite the opposite, Chairman. The government is not going to take such a serious decision until we're sure we've got the maximal
51 days
information
to go.
in
You
front
should
of
know
us.
by now. Julia Lopez.
I just want to know, in elaborating on that, is there a comprehensive list of items which the UK doesn't currently produce where we could afford to drop tariffs to zero?
So there are 15,000 tariff lines, and yes, there are areas where if tariffs were to be reduced, it would not have an impact on the UK and would have a benefit to UK consumers. Throughout it, there needs to be a balance, of course, between the impact on consumers and the impact on producers, and the government's very clear that it needs to give protection where necessary but without becoming protectionist.
So the government has identified those products where the UK doesn't have an interest, as it were, and therefore could afford to drop the tariff to zero. I mean, is there such a list that exists?
There is, yes, across the tariff lines. There is work across departments, BAYS, DEFRA, DIT, to look to see where there would be a need to protect, if you like, UK producers, but without having a disproportionate impact on UK consumers. That is always the balance.
Yeah, where there's no UK production. You touched upon the problems we would have because of most favoured nation rules in giving differential access to the EU or having differential tariffs with the EU. And this is something where people are looking at Article 24 of the GATT to see whether you could drop the tariffs to zero or keep them as they are at the moment while we're trying to negotiate a free trade agreement. What's your understanding of Article 24 and how applicable it could be in this situation?
Well, my understanding is that Article 1 takes precedence that we cannot have different tariffs. And we wouldn't want to go into our position as an independent member of the WTO in breach of the first article.
So you don't foresee a situation where both the UK and the EU could agree to an Article 24 situation that would allow us to essentially maintain the status quo until we were able to arrange an FTA?
Well, of course, my understanding is that Article 24 is only applicable where two sides already have agreed a trade agreement, but haven't yet fully implemented it, perhaps not ratified it. So I don't see it as being applicable.
Just to expand on Joe Lopez's question there. The question was, are there areas that are currently tariffed where the UK has no interest, but the EU more widely has an interest? And you said there's some work happening within the DIT with that. On the reverse, the European Union might have tariffs on some areas of products that are only there because the UK wanted them, and the EU now might have no interest in having tariffs in that area. Has the DIT done any work to see if the UK was to get rid of tariffs that it's no selfish interest in, that the EU might also have an area of tariffs which are only there because of the UK, and that of course would then affect producers in the UK selling into that market if the EU was to go to search for these products more than in the European continent. They went
well, of
global,
course, the
Europe.
European unions would have to abide by the same WTO rules and couldn't apply higher tariffs to the UK than to the rest of the world.
If, for instance, a good example of the UK getting rid of a tariff on oranges, which the UK does not produce, no selfish interest, it's a possibility, yeah? Then say there's some product that I can't think of at the moment, but there might well be one, that the UK produces but the rest of the EU doesn't. Has any work been done in the DIT of the European Union not having a selfish interest in having a tariff in that area, how that might affect the UK?
Well, we wouldn't be responsible as a third country for
but
what the EU would decide to do in terms of tariff policy. If you
removed a tariff that was to affect European Union producers, might they then be looking to remove tariffs that would be affecting, that were only there for the UK, and now the UK is gone, they don't need to have these tariffs?
Well, we have no idea what EU tariff policy will be or what the assumptions will be.
Do you not scope that as a risk?
We would take decisions that we believe to be in the interests of the United Kingdom. And if on citrus fruit, for example, we were able to get a wider supply at lower prices for British consumers, why would we not do that?
And if the European Union was to do this similarly and not take UK products, you'd be happy with that, and you would. This is a risk that you have investigated and has crossed your mind before.
Well, they would. They couldn't apply higher tariffs to the UK.
No, I'm not saying. I'm not saying
but
higher. I'm saying reduce the tariffs. You've surely considered that the European Union might reduce tariffs that they now currently have at the behest and the need and the benefit of the UK. But the UK, no longer in the European Union, might get rid of those tariffs.
I can't see where a reduction of tariffs would be harmful.
Unless unless the producer being protected is in the UK. Yeah, this hasn't crossed your mind before.
I'm not entirely clear what
I can see that.
What the argument is.
West.
On the question of the government procurement agreement, which you've mentioned already, how realistic is it to expect that UK accession to the GPA will be ratified by Parliament in time for a possible no-deal Brexit, given that under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, the relevant treaty must be laid before Parliament for 21 days without either House objecting?
Thank you for that. The GPA has been a difficult negotiation. But we, at the GPA committee meeting on the 27th of November, the GPA parties provided agreement in principle to the UK's GPA market access offer and accession. And that was quite a significant milestone in our ability to do that. And of course, since that time, the EU and the UK have been in the process of concluding our discussions on the text of the decision that will invite the UK to join the GPA. The difficulty was under the wording that had to cover both deal and no deal scenarios. We're very close to an agreement on that. The current draft which we're reviewing has a solution whereby the UK can deposit its instrument of accession to the GPA while still an EU member state. That was a point of some dispute earlier on. And if we have an agreement under the withdrawal agreement and an IP, then it would be deemed not to have occurred. And we would simply continue under the cover of the EU. Am I confident that it will happen? Yes, I'm confident that it will happen. If we have set out in a statutory instrument our means by creating the power under other legislation to enable us to do it if we have to, if we don't have the trade bill through on time. But in either case, I'm confident that we will be able to join the GPA as an independent member as we leave the European Union.
And following that, there might be some domestic procurement legislation which is required. What's the impact of that on the National Health Service and other sort of health service providers?
We've made very clear that under any legislative proposal or any treaty that the government reserves the right to regulate its own public services. So in terms of the National Health Service, the government would not allow regulation that we thought threatened the National Health Service.
For example, if there was a trade negotiation with a third party, which was very much to get everything, it did mean liberalising healthcare, and we know that that's one of the areas which the US is interested in, you can categorically rule out any changes to the way that national health services are provided.
We already have done so. We've already done that in the CETA agreement, in Annex 2 to the CETA agreement. It was reaffirmed that we have absolute right to regulate in our own public services. That is part of the treaty agreement. And it's the principle that we would want to carry forward. When we had the debate on CETA in the House, I made it very clear that we regarded the elements of non-regression, for example, on labour rights and on environmental standards to be the model that we would want to adopt for future trade agreements, and also the protection of regulation of the public services, including the health service.
Thank you. My question.
Thank you, Chair. Just following up on this, there was an announcement about from the French government that with the French Navy, they've announced the purchase of some logistical support ships at a cost of 1.9 billion. Under GPA, how do you think they would have gone about tendering that? Would they have complied with GPA?
Of course, we have exceptions in terms of national security when it comes to our procurement.
Standard support ships.
You would hope that that under GPA, countries would allow those who are part of the agreement to get as much access as possible.
Thank you.
Secretary of State, I wrote to you last week asking which government departments are responsible for each of the 40 or so EU trade agreements that the UK is seeking to roll over. As this information is not the clearest, or wasn't the clearest, and your response did not provide the information, can you tell us now?
I'll write to you with exactly which departments are responsible for which of them, but the Department in general, Department for International Trade and DFID are responsible for the trade elements, and the economic partnership agreements, and the Foreign Office takes responsibility for the association agreements.
So your second response?
But there's not a. But I wouldn't like to give the impression that there's an absolute delineation, because there are different elements that cross over from one to the other. It's a genuinely cross-government exercise, and it has to be.
Okay, I'll wait for your second reply on that same topic. Also asked for a comprehensive and definitive list on which trade agreements need to be rolled over by March 2019, 29th of March. You replied saying, We will not provide a commentary on ongoing discussions, as it is the government's prerogative power to make international treaties, and in addition, these matters are commercially sensitive. The thing is, I wasn't asking for a commentary, I was simply asking for a list. Can you provide this list to the committee, please?
That list is already published on the EU website. It's publicly available.
Well, why wasn't this then provided to us if these trade-related agreements?
The agreements are publicly available on the website. I would have thought that the committee would have had it.
Does this include those?
These are the need to be rolled over. These are the ones needing to be rolled over. Yeah, that list is publicly available. You see,
the list of EU international agreements are there.
No, the ones that you want to roll over.
The ones you want to roll over, they need to be rolled over.
Oh, the list of those agreements fall under 16 DIT and DFIDs. And a number are FCO-led, but not purely FCO.
I don't think we're going to get a list of this one. Can we get a definitive list of your trade-related agreements that need to be rolled over by March 2019? The committee needs to know this. We need to know that 51 days time.
Yes.
We're asking for this. We've asked before, as we've asked.
Yes, of those, yes, we can provide you with those, and of those agreements that are necessary for continuity of trade, I'm confident that if we have a withdrawal agreement, all of them will be rolled over and will provide continuity of trade for the UK. I'm confident there are no exceptions. If we have a withdrawal agreement, yes.
So that's not in a second after midnight in March the 29th. That's by December 2020.
No, if we have an agreement, all those, we will have continuity of all those agreements. If we have withdrawal agreement.
This is another incident. So all 70 countries have agreed to roll over, have they, in those 40 agreements?
All countries have agreed that the EU process of deeming to have continuity will be in place. I am not aware of a single country that has said that they don't want to do that.
No, that's a different thing between not being aware of a single country and that's a negative. But they've all positively told you, these 70 countries, that they will play ball with UK
We've
and the EU.
been in discussion with all of them.
No. I'm not interested in discussions. I'm interested in have they all positively told you yes?
Yes, the discussions.
There's 51 days to go.
The discussions
that have happened in the last 2 years. Are those 70 countries saying yes?
Am I confident that they will all be trade continuity agreements if we have a withdrawal agreement with the European Union? Yes, I am.
Your confidence is great, and that's fine. But I'm not asking about your confidence. I'm asking, have all 70 countries said yes?
All the countries that we have been in discussions with have agreed to the continuity process. If we get a withdrawal agreement,
all 70 countries have said yes. Japan, South Korea, the lot. They've all said yes.
Japan is
South Korea.
No. South, in the event of a withdrawal agreement, yes.
No,
if we get the withdrawal agreement
for 21 months, they're going to roll over. All 70 have agreed to roll over. And there's a difference between you saying you've not got any information that they won't roll over, but this is all 70 have in writing agreed to roll over.
In terms of continuity, if we get a withdrawal agreement
for 21 months, they'll roll over.
We think that they will all be in place immediately
I'm not saying what you think. You're certain they've agreed to this?
I was just going to add that obviously the formal notification will happen once the withdrawal agreement is made. So at the moment, obviously, we have had informal contacts with all these countries. And that's why it's difficult to respond quite to your question, but all the contacts we've had with them have been positive.
But if you're naive in trade, you could think you've got an agreement, and then at the last minute they squeeze you for a concession. If I was seeing a naive country coming down the road looking for 70 countries, I'd think, easy peasy, here we come. Anybody might do that? Is that possible?
Well, countries will look to the UK and see that we are the 5th biggest economy and market in the world and will want to export to the United Kingdom. Why would a country not wish to do that? That's why we've already got the first 3 agreements, which we've laid today, the text, the explanatory memorandum, and the parliamentary report, which was promised during the passage of the trade bill. And on Monday, I will sign the agreement in Switzerland, which is the largest of all those trade agreements, which will be, I think, very symbolic in that it will set out very clearly.
We will come to Switzerland later as time is ever our enemy. Faisal Rashid.
Just following on, Secretary of State. Obviously, there are, as per my understanding, the Chile and Eastern and Southern African states and the Faroe Islands, those rollover agreements has been already signed. Is that correct? Right. Okay, so that's public information. So why can't you
So they are
publicize
published.
the other 40 or so?
They're published today, and as we sign them, as will happen in Switzerland on Monday, we will then, as we promised, set out publish the text, the explanatory memorandum, and the political agreement that we said that we would pass, as I said, during the trade bill, one at a time, as they happen.
So you have enough time in 51 days that all 40 or so agreements will be signed?
Well, we hope to do so. And in the event of a no deal, of course, that's different from trade continuity. If we get a withdrawal agreement, I go back to my earlier point. If we want trade continuity, the best way is to have the withdrawal agreement passed and to have an agreement with the European Union. That's our best way of guaranteeing trade continuity. Those who vote against having a withdrawal agreement have to understand that they are introducing a level of risk into that wouldn't exist were we to have the withdrawal agreement.
Secretary of State, Brexit Secretary recently wrote to certain select committee chairs about rollover agreements, but not the chair of this committee. And we have been doing extensive scrutiny work in this area. Were you involved in preparation of that letter? And if you were, then did you tell the Brexit Secretary that this chair should need to?
I was unaware of this until now. I would have expected the committee to be given the same information as other committees.
And we didn't.
I'm surprised if that's not the case.
Do you remember when one of the trade ministers, Lord Price, gave us the runaround that all had been rolled over? It was a tweet.
Yeah, tweet. Yeah.
All have agreed to roll over. That was 2 years ago. You remember we were being given the runaround then, and in response to the chair a moment ago, when he asked whether all have agreed to roll over, even in the event of a withdrawal agreement, you said yes, they have all agreed to do that. Your official then helped out by saying, well, there's been positive discussions, and you also then started to say you're hopeful that they will. But just to be absolutely crystal clear, is there agreement to roll over all of them, even in the event of a withdrawal agreement, or is that an aspiration?
Well, all have indicated a willingness to do so.
In writing?
But as has already been pointed out, the actual point at which they would make that decision is when the withdrawal agreement is published.
So they've all indicated, as a matter of policy, all those countries, they will roll over.
As far as I'm aware.
No. As far as you're aware isn't, with respect, good enough. Have they or haven't they?
So they have the countries that we've talked to, they have been positive about the approach of a continuity, because that is the simplest way of achieving a rollover, as you call it. As I said, that depends on the withdrawal agreement being finalised and agreed, and then the Commission will notify those countries. So obviously that will be the point at which they formally confirm that. But we've had substantial contacts with them already.
And of course, this is in the event of a withdrawal agreement and an IP.
Yeah.
It is for
that's in your positive.
It's for the Commission. It's for the Commission then to notify those countries that they automatically continue, because Britain at that point will continue.
But you understand it's their choice too. They have a say in this. You know, it's up to the South Koreans or wherever. They also have to say, okay, we'll go along with this. But according to you, they've all agreed this.
Why, in terms of continuity, would a country that currently has an agreement with the European Union not want to have an agreement with the European Union?
Perfectly reasonable question, but that's not that. You know, you're saying they have agreed. It does matter, Secretary of State, doesn't it?
Are we living on your assumptions, or are we living on their agreements?
Well, our working assumption is that we will have full continuity. If you're
what's
asking,
that based on?
Do you think we will have full continuity? Yes, I think we will have full continuity.
They've told you this.
I think that we will have full continuity, because I think it makes no sense for any country to not
That's
want to have
logic. But you've got to put them yourself in somebody else's shoes.
And our
They might have
discussions,
other reasons that you haven't envisaged.
we have had no indications from any of the countries that we've spoken to that they wouldn't want to have a continuity agreement. And why would they not want to have a continuity agreement?
Because they might want to get a trade advantage. As you, they know you're more desperate for a continuity agreement, and they might want a trade advantage. Surely you've gained that.
No, I think this is confusing no deal and deal. In a deal, it's exactly the same agreement, because the EU deems it to be continuity of the agreement in place. There is no change.
In a deal, there are three partners: there's the EU, the UK, and a third party.
In a deal scenario, the European Union deems the agreements to continue. They don't change.
Yeah,
there's no negotiation.
The party to the deal to agree to this. Can we get back to Faisal Rashid?
I think that's an important point here.
So in a deal situation, the UK would not be able to negotiate because we continue to be covered by the EU Common Commercial Policy.
Julia Lopez.
It's not a question that arises.
Dare I suggest, if all of the rollover was agreed, you then have an issue of ratification. And when we were in South Korea, they discussed the fact that they would have to go through the South Korean Parliament, and that could take 3 months in order for that agreement to be ratified. Is that your understanding? And if so, are there interim arrangements that can be put in place to cover trade in between agreement and ratification?
This is in the event of no deal.
Yes.
So what we were discussing a moment ago was in the event of a deal. We don't negotiate those agreements again. They are simply continuity agreements deemed by the European Union to continue. That's an argument. This is a separate argument. This is about, in a no-deal scenario, what do we do with agreements that we want to have continuity of trade? Yes, some countries have legislative issues, and we're looking with them to see whether there are legal mechanisms that are WTO compatible to maintain trade during what might be a legal hiatus, not for us, but potentially for them. Mm-hmm. The aim is, it's not a numbers game about agreements. It's about the continuity of trade. It's how we find mechanisms to ensure that in the event of a no deal, we don't get disruption to that trade. The EU agreements that we're talking about in total are about 12.1% of our trade. It's a little 2.2% more if you add the Japan EPA. Of that 12.1%, about 9% is accounted for by the 5 largest agreements. And therefore, there's priority given in terms of continuity of trade to getting those. Just to put it in scale, of the bottom 21 agreements account for only 0.9% of total trade.
And I just want to know what discussions you've been able to have with Turkey. The reason I think Turkey is an interesting case is because my reading of the existing backstop would be that if we have to enter the backstop, the UK would be in a similar trading position to Turkey, where we have, in effect, a de facto customs union for goods and not services. I was wondering how successful any discussions have been with Turkey, and whether Turkey is effectively able to have independent discussions with the UK as a partial member of the customs union or a customs union.
Well, Turkey is in a difficult position because it's subjected to common commercial policy and duty of sincere cooperation. For the UK to talk and have negotiations with Turkey would be potentially to encourage Turkey to break that duty of sincere cooperation, which of course we're not willing to do as long as we're members of the European Union. It does pose some of the difficulties that a country would have in being able to operate an independent trade policy were it to be in either a full or partial customs union. One of the reasons why I'm very much opposed to a customs union option for the UK.
What's more important, trade policies or trade?
The trade that we have is the key to our prosperity.
Trade is more important than trade policies, so you might be ripping up our trade policies with 48% of our trading partners to have trade policies somewhere else. You know, that just ensuring that you understand the clear difference between trade and trade policies.
And they overlap. Since you mentioned the ceramics industry earlier, one of the key gains that we would have in an independent trade policy would be able to do a trade agreement with the United States, where there's currently a 27% tariff on UK ceramics being sold into the United States. That would be a huge trade gain.
Mark Weston.
Thank you, Chair.
You give away.
Just, I couldn't help but notice on your desk, Secretary of State, you had a table and it looked like there was a lot of red on it and orange. Anything you should be telling us about that? Sort of?
Yes, I'm colourblind.
Ah, okay. Someone else who produced the paper perhaps isn't, though.
Yes, the normal ways of coding don't really work for me.
But maybe they do for the rest of your department.
They have to operate on the basis that we now, yes. When I was, it's not as severe as when I was Secretary of State for Defence, when during the Libyan campaign and when the maps were marked in red and green for our respective positions, it was impossible for me to know whether we were winning or losing.
I would have been concerned for you.
Colourblindness is not a restriction of time.
Can I just move on to the impact, the very real impact for businesses out there who are extremely concerned about the preparations in terms of rolling over trade agreements or indeed a no-deal Brexit. What measures are you taking to help them?
So in the event, as we look at no-deal preparations, if we think that there is a risk that we will not be able to roll over certain agreements on time, we will issue technical notices for businesses. And my current timetable is to do that sometime in the next 2 weeks to make those available. It may well be that companies would want to think about what would happen were we not able to get those agreements. It may, of course, be that we end up getting them. But I think it's reasonable for us to indicate a warning that they may not be achievable.
Right. And obviously there's a huge amount of stockpiling going on, huge cost to our business sector, particularly our manufacturing sector. That presumably concerns you.
I think, again, the best answer to all of that is, of course, for us to get an agreement and to reach an agreement with the European Union. But in terms of behaving in a prudent manner, we will want to make those warnings clear and explicit.
The automotive industry is one that's particularly concerned. We heard about the story of Nissan recently. Of course, that's not purely down to Brexit. There's other major factors that come into play there. But the alarm bells are beginning to ring. John Neal, from Unipart, who was at Davos last month, described your credibility actually as extremely low, and that you actually don't understand or appreciate the dangers of a no-deal Brexit. He actually imagines a cascade of failure, saying that the future of the UK car industry is at risk. I know that the member for Uxbridge seems to be an expert in this particular field. I'm not sure if you are, but how do you respond to that?
Well, I think that, I said, no deal would be disruptive. But I think we have to guard against excessive pessimism in terms of no deal, and against excessive optimism from those who say no deal wouldn't be a problem at all. There is somewhere in between.
The chief executives of Jaguar Land Rover, Ford, here Unipart, are saying this is existential stuff, not just being fear-mongering or...
Well, existential would suggest that in the event of a no deal, we would have no car industry. I just don't find that credible.
Well, the potential loss of hundreds of millions of pounds...
Well, that's not the same as... that's not existential. Let me be very clear. I do not want there to be a no-deal outcome to Brexit, because I think it will be disruptive. It will be disruptive for our agricultural sector. It will be disruptive for a number of parts of our manufacturing sectors. I want there to be a deal. I think this is where those people in industry that you mentioned should be making the case for the government's deal and encouraging all members of Parliament to ensure that it goes through.
David Hennig said that 0% tariffs and a no deal would actually result in a huge economic shock for this country. Matthew Lesh of the Adam Smith Institute, with whom you may have more in common, believes that 0% tariffs would be a good thing, and it would concentrate our minds on those sectors that we're good at, such as service sector, but at the loss of manufacturing and farming. Do you agree with him and the Adam Smith Institute?
If you're asking, do I believe in loss of comparative advantage? Yes, I do. But in all the trade agreements that we have, even when we have tariff liberalisation, it tends to be done over a period of time to allow economies to adjust. I've not suggested, as I said earlier, the concept of zero tariffs.
But it's on the table, and it's going to be put on the table on the 11th of February, we hear.
If globally we all move to a lower tariff environment, that is beneficial eventually for everybody.
Except that countries like China and the US are actually putting more tariffs on at this time, which
is,
will actually expose us and make us more vulnerable.
My views on that are very clear, that those tariffs are ultimately taxes. Tariffs are unlikely to add to the productivity or the efficiency of an economy.
But better that the consumers are actually earning money in manufacturing that they can then spend in the market.
If you apply, as happened in the US, for example, a tariff on steel, you cannot be surprised if your steel prices go up as a consequence. And you cannot be surprised later on if those industries that use that steel find themselves in a less competitive position. If you apply tariffs, which are taxes, to any industry, any commodity, ultimately it will have an impact on competitiveness.
Thank you.
Just briefly, before I move to Catherine West, a few weeks ago we wrote in part of an investment policy inquiry to Dyson and invited James Dyson to come next week to our committee. Mr Dyson is, I'm afraid, is unavailable next week. We're hoping for somebody else to appear in his place, but if he doesn't, as Secretary of State for International Trade, can you see some logic in what Dyson have done in their Singapore move?
Well, I understand that it's not me to comment on individual companies, but I understand that there was a movement of 2 people while the company continues to invest in its research and development in the UK on the basis that this is one of the best countries in which to have innovation, which is entirely compatible with the level of investment coming into the UK at the present time. And it is interesting that while there is the uncertainty politically around the Brexit debate, that while global foreign direct investment fell 40% last year, it rose 20% in the UK.
Was that for Greenfield FDI, or was that for acquisitions and mergers?
These are the UNCTAD figures.
Which, acquisitions and mergers?
Which are a broader measure.
Because there's 2 types of FDI, and be very careful. A cheap pound can make a very easy pick-off.
I understand that, but it's very clear from the Deloitte report published 2 weeks ago that investment is continuing into the UK because it is a very good place to find innovative and flexible workforce.
Hopefully Dyson can come or send a representative next week to further that question. Catherine West.
I'm very disappointed that Mr Dyson refused to be subject to elected members and their questions. On the question,
nothing to do with me, I have to say.
But I do want it on the record. Because
to be on the record is unavailable, is the phrase.
He was unavailable.
Yeah.
My question is just about the Swiss deal. The committee requested a copy of the text so that we could further our understanding and deepen our understanding of the negotiation, and the department refused our request. And after some research, we noticed that there was a 3,000-word essay on the Swiss government website, which did give us most of the information that we needed. Is this really the tone that the department wants to set with this committee of obfuscation and refusal to come for scrutiny to this committee? Because I think it's a very bad way to get off in terms of the way that we are seeking information for very good reasons, given that it's 51 days before a potential no-deal Brexit.
When we won't say too much now, because I do intend to say something in the House of Commons next week if possible.
Well, you don't need to, because the Swiss government's done it for you.
In terms of scrutiny of future free trade agreements, I think it's important that we have a mechanism in Parliament that enables us to be able to scrutinise in real time those agreements. Those will be new agreements. These are continuity agreements. But when it comes to new agreements, I've always been very much of the opinion that when we started to be able to do those as an independent, with an independent trade policy, that Parliament was able to have a view in real time of what was happening in negotiations.
So why aren't you starting as you mean to go on?
We had set out at the beginning of this process that as we finished each agreement, as it got to the point of signature, we would do what we have already done, which is to publish not just the text, the explanatory memorandum and the full parliamentary report. That's the process that we agreed during the passage of the trade bill, and that's what we will stick to.
Is it normal for members of Parliament to have to research other governments' websites to understand what is being negotiated between this government and another government?
Well, our Parliament set out what the process would be, and that process is set out in the trade bill. And it's exactly as I say, when we get to the point of signature, that we would make those documents fully available to Parliament.
It's about culture and tone, and there is a risk that you are turning very interested members into having to be detectives to find out what our own government is meant to be doing, and that is not the way that in a hung Parliament a department should function.
We said that we would set them out. We said that we would set out the text, the explanatory memorandum, and an explanation of any changes that had occurred as a result of the ongoing discussion, and then it would be subject to full parliamentary procedure after that. It's set out clearly in the trade bill, which of course was voted through by the House of Commons.
Time behind time. What happens with Switzerland if there's no withdrawal agreement? If you've no withdrawal agreement, what's your situation with the Swiss? I mean, it's much trumpeted with the Swiss, but 51 days to go. There's no real clue what's happening with Brexit. Nobody does. Nobody knows which way it's going to go. But from your point of view, with the withdrawal agreement, no withdrawal agreement, what happens with Switzerland? Do you have a deal on 29th of March?
Yes.
So this covers both scenarios,
yes.
Deal and no deal, yes. And they're just the same. It'll all be fine.
And if there's a deal, it would come into effect at the end of the implementation period.
Chris, you want to come in briefly?
If there's no deal, the Swiss agreement is still a rollover in a no-deal scenario, is it?
It comes in on the 29th of March.
Yes, that's right.
And
So we've been trying to establish, not just on the full fat FTAs, full free trade agreements. Obviously, we've got the number from you on those. But how many trade-related agreements have to be rolled over if we want full continuity of trade? You'll be aware that the Financial Times put that figure at something around 759 different treaties, agreements, mutual recognition agreements, and so forth. What is your number of trade-related agreements that need to be rolled over for full continuity?
We've always said around 40, and there's a reason why it's not a specific number.
40.
Because some are already in place. Some of those EU agreements are in place. Some are partly in place. So, for example, the Fiji agreement, which is or the CARIFORUM agreement. There are some that are pending. The Kenya agreement, which has not been signed. On the East African community one, because Tanzania won't do it. Some are being updated, like Mexico or Morocco.
I think maybe you're misunderstanding my question. I was asking, obviously, you've got the number of full free trade agreements, FTAs. I'm talking about trade-related agreements.
I'm sorry, I didn't
understand the question. It's that bigger number, because there are MRAs, other treaties, aviation, yes. So forth.
Yes.
Mr. Alty, do you know the number?
So I know the number for this department, DIT. There are 7 mutual recognition agreements. Some of those are included in the actual trade agreements.
I'm thinking about for the whole of the UK government.
Yeah.
Are you not holding the pen on the whole?
No, so the Department for Exiting the EU is managing the whole programme of international agreements.
What's their number?
You'd have to ask DEXU what their total number is. I mean, some of those are related to trade, some of them are less so. They're covering nuclear safety, all sorts of things. So we are focusing on the trade ones.
Final question, Secretary of State. You've got a lot of thinking up to the 29th of March. If there's no deal, there are queues at Dover, there are things not on the shelves. Is that politically survivable for any government to have taken the country it's governing into that sort of situation?
The government's very clear that what it wants is an agreement.
Yes. No, but if on the 2nd of April you haven't achieved this...
But we are focusing all our energies on getting an agreement with the European Union.
Only buy you 21 months. Same trouble in December 2020.
We believe that we're very close to an agreement. It's very clear that the one sticking point at the moment relates to the Irish border. That's what all our energies
are ready to compromise on that?
And I believe that from the vote in the House of Commons, are we able to resolve that problem, then we'll be able to get an agreement. I just hope that all parties in the House of Commons will recognise that and not obstruct a withdrawal agreement which could put us in the territory of no deal.
Thank you. The government is stockpiling at the moment, I understand from particularly the Department of Health. Should individual citizens be stockpiling in case you don't get the show on the road in 51 days' time?
No, I think that it's very clear that the government's entire efforts are focused on getting an agreement. I mean, I can't emphasise enough that we're very close to having that agreement, that the one issue remains the Irish border, that the Prime Minister's efforts are going into resolving that. If we're able to resolve that, the indications from Parliament are we will get an agreement. Any members of Parliament who don't vote for an agreement will have to understand that increases the chance of no deal with all its consequences, which the committee has set out today.
Safest thing might be to revoke the TRA. Will that be in place in December, on March the 29th?
Yes, sir, and we will, should the trade bill not be in place again, we will have contingency plans to ensure that it's able to be fully operational.
Secretary of State, thank you very much for this morning's ping pong. I will see you again, I believe, on the 6th of March for part 2 of our discussions. Thank you very much indeed. Order, order.